Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I return with 8 of the most disturbing crime stories ever to emerge from Spokane, Washington, a city where darkness seems to settle deeper than anywhere else in the Pacific Northwest. In this episode, we will descend into the twisted reality of cases that have haunted investigators, shattered families, and left questions that may never find answers. These are not folklore or urban legends passed down through generations. These are documented incidents pulled from police reports, court testimonies, and the first-hand accounts of those who survived encounters with evil wearing a human face. From unexplained disappearances in wooded areas where search parties found only folded clothing and unanswered questions, to individuals who claimed something beyond their control forced them to commit unspeakable acts. Each story has been reconstructed from the fragmented memories of witnesses and the cold evidence left behind. To protect the privacy of survivors and respect ongoing investigations, certain names and identifying details have been altered, but the essence of what happened remains untouched and undeniable. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true crime content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls, because in Spokane the shadows have stories to tell, and tonight we give them a voice. The night Cooper vanished, Spokane felt smaller than it ever had, like the whole city had folded in around one gas station parking lot on East Sprague. February air cut straight through my jacket when we pulled in, the kind of cold that made the neon signs look sharper and the shadows heavier. We had just left a late show at the knitting factory, our ears still humming from the last encore, and the streets were slick with dirty snow pushed into gray ridges along the curb. Cooper killed the engine, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel twice, and said he needed a smoke before driving back across the river. He always did that when he was anxious. 2 taps on the wheel, thumb over the keys, glance at the rearview mirror a little too long. It was 11:39 p.m. when we pulled into the lot. I remember because I checked the time to see if the gas station coffee would be fresh or taste like it had been sitting there since morning. The place was quiet, just us, a beat-up pickup at the far pump, and the bored clerk inside leaning on the lotto counter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, turning everything that sick supermarket color that made Cooper joke it was impossible to look healthy under them. He asked if I wanted anything. I said I would grab coffee and meet him back at the car. He stood there for a second, hands in his pockets, eyes on the thin line of trees behind the station that separated the lot from a small strip of woods and the train tracks beyond. "I am going to take a minute," he said. "Clear my head. Smoking area is basically over there anyway." He jerked his chin toward the tree line. I thought it was weird. There was a trash can and an ashtray bolted to the concrete 5 steps from the door. But Cooper had been off all evening, quieter than usual, zoning out mid-conversation like he was listening to something I could not hear. The clerk barely looked up when I went inside. Stale smell of burnt coffee grounds, floor cleaner, and something fried that had died several hours earlier. I poured the darkest sludge they had, checked my phone, scrolled for a minute, and paid. It could not have been more than 6 or 7 minutes. When I stepped back outside, my breath ghosted in front of me in thick white clouds and the lot felt too empty. The passenger side of Cooper's Subaru was still open, dome lights spilling onto the cracked asphalt. But he was not there. I called his name across the lot, half expecting him to jump out from behind the car and start laughing. He loved doing that, trying to scare people when they came around corners. Nothing. The only sound was the buzzing lights and a truck downshifting somewhere on the road behind the station. I walked to the edge of the pavement where the light faded into darkness. The trees looked like a solid wall from there, their trunks crowded tight together, branches rattling in the wind. A narrow dirt path cut into the black between them, packed down by countless smokers or kids taking shortcuts. I could see the soft glow of cigarette embers a few times a week in that direction when we drove by. "Coop?" I called again, stepping closer to the edge of the lot. My shoes slid a little on the frozen mud. No answer. There was this odd stillness, like the wind had paused to listen. I told myself he was just messing with me. I hated how my voice sounded when I called out again, too thin and high. I pulled out my phone and dialed him. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then the sound changed and I realized I could hear his ringtone faintly from the direction of the trees. He did not pick up. I remember standing there, coffee cup going cold in my hand, thinking it was just another one of his jokes. Cooper was always the one pushing things a little too far for a laugh. Back in high school, he would hide in people's closets during parties, waiting an hour until everyone forgot about him, then step out at the worst possible moment. Once he lay in the middle of the road after a storm just to take pictures of reflections in puddles and nearly gave a neighbor a heart attack. So I told myself this was another version of that. 10 minutes passed. The clerk came to the door, flicked a cigarette butt into the trash and asked if everything was okay. I told him my friend had gone around back for a smoke. He shrugged and went inside. I dialed again, straight to voicemail this time. I texted him a string of annoyed messages, then a joking threat to leave without him, then a final simple, "Seriously, where are you?" By the 20-minute mark, the cold had worked its way through my jeans and into my bones. My brain did that thing it does where it quietly lays out worst-case scenarios like cards on a table. Maybe he slipped and hit his head. Maybe someone jumped him. Maybe he walked farther than I thought and was messing with me from the tracks. That last one felt right enough to quiet the others for a minute. I locked the car, told the clerk I was going to check on my friend, and stepped off the pavement onto the frozen path. The darkness swallowed me faster than I expected. The harsh white glow from the gas station cut off in a hard line behind me. Ahead, the world narrowed to the weak rectangle of my phone flashlight. The crunch of ice under my feet sounded too loud. The trees crowded closer, branches clawing at my jacket. I kept calling his name, softer now, embarrassed for no good reason. 3 minutes in, the path forked. One branch headed toward where I knew the tracks ran. The other dipped down into a shallow depression where water collected in spring. I shone my light both ways. No footprints I could trust, just frozen ridges and patches of bare dirt. Part of me wanted to turn back and just call the police from the safety of the car. Another part of me, the stubborn part that had known Cooper since we were kids playing hide and seek in the park, refused to believe this was anything more than him being an idiot. I followed the path toward the tracks. The ringtone sound I had heard earlier nagged at me, but now the forest just breathed around me in creaks and occasional gusts of wind. I walked until the trees opened onto the gravel bed by the tracks. Empty. No sign of him. No cigarette butts, no scuffed dirt, nothing. That was the moment the bottom dropped out of my rational explanations. The path had only taken a few minutes. There were no other clear ways he could have gone unless he had pushed straight through the underbrush, leaving obvious signs behind. And yet there was nothing. I stood on the edge of the tracks, watching a far-off signal light blink red, and felt a thin thread of panic wrap around my throat. Back at the station, I used the gas station's landline to call 911. I told them my friend had walked toward the trees and not come back, that I had checked the path as far as the tracks and seen nothing. The dispatcher asked all the questions they are trained to ask. Was he intoxicated? On any medication? History of mental illness? Any reason to think he might hurt himself? I kept saying no, no, no until the word lost shape. A patrol car arrived about 20 minutes later, lights flashing silently in the cold night. The officer took my statement while another walked the path with a stronger flashlight and less hesitation than I had managed. They found nothing, no signs of a struggle, no dropped phone, no footprints they could distinguish from mine. They told me maybe he had gotten a ride from someone, decided to walk home, or gone to a nearby bar. I kept insisting he would not just leave his car running, his jacket on the seat, his wallet in the cup holder. They wrote it all down, promised to review the security footage in the morning, and suggested I go home and get some rest. I did not go home. I drove the surrounding streets for hours, checking every bar and late-night spot we used to haunt, calling mutual friends to see if he had turned up. No one had heard from him. At 4:30 a.m., my phone buzzed. For a second, my heart stopped, thinking it was him. It was the officer. They had pulled the footage from the gas station cameras. The video showed our car pulling in at 11:39 p.m. Me going inside, Cooper getting out, pacing near the pumps for a minute, then walking toward the tree line at 11:47. He did not look drunk. He did not look upset, just thoughtful, maybe a little tired, shoulders hunched against the cold. The camera caught him as far as the edge of the lot, his figure shrinking into the distance. Then he stepped into the darkness between the trees and disappeared from the frame. He never came back out. There was no sign of anyone following him, no other cars, no one else walking nearby. It was like the woods had opened and swallowed him. The official missing person report went in that morning. For the first few days, it felt like nothing but action. Volunteers stapling his photo to light poles. Family flying in from out of town. Search and rescue trucks parked along the narrow service roads. Dogs combing the underbrush. Helicopters sweeping the area with thermal cameras. Everyone assumed we would find something. A trail. A piece of clothing, footprints beyond where I had walked. Something to explain how a grown man could vanish less than 100 yards from a busy street. Day 3, they found his jacket. It turned up on a moss-covered stump nearly 3 miles north of the gas station, deep in a patch of woods most people only ever saw from a distance while speeding past on the highway. The stump sat in a small clearing ringed by thin young pines like a stage. The jacket was folded with unsettling precision, sleeves tucked under, zipper aligned in the middle, the way Cooper never folded anything in his life. His phone was in the pocket, powered off. There were no footprints leading to or from the stump that anyone could reliably match to him. The recent snow and freeze had turned the ground into an unreadable mess. The investigators tried to make sense of it. Maybe he had walked on the tracks and cut through. Maybe someone had taken him by car and then staged the jacket there later. Every theory frayed at the edges. The dogs lost his scent not long after the path left the gas station lot. The phone record showed nothing after my last call that went to voicemail. No outgoing calls, no texts, no data usage. It was as if the device had gone dark the second he stepped between those trees. Weeks passed. The active search scaled back, replaced by thin leads that went nowhere. A blurry sighting in a convenience store 2 towns over turned out to be someone else. A report from a bus driver about a man mumbling to himself on a late-night route led to an unhoused veteran who had never heard of Cooper. His family clung to hope longer than the rest of us. His mother posted in local Facebook groups every day, asking anyone who had been near Sprague that night to check their dash cams. A few people did. None of the footage showed him beyond what we already knew. I tried to move on. You tell yourself life has to keep going. You still have to go to work, pay rent, buy groceries. But everything in Spokane started to feel rearranged around the empty space where he used to be. Every time I passed a patch of trees, I found myself scanning the shadows for a folded jacket on a stump. Every time my phone rang late at night, my chest clenched before I even looked at the screen. About 2 months after he disappeared, I was at my parents' house for dinner when the news played a segment on 3 other missing persons cases in the county. A young woman who vanished walking home from a bar near the university. A middle-aged man whose car was found idling at the edge of a park, driver's door open. A teenager who never came back from walking his dog on the outskirts of town. They all had one detail in common. Last seen heading toward wooded areas alone at night. The map they displayed showed little red dots where each had been last seen. Something about the pattern bothered me. It nagged while I pretended to listen to my mother talk about work. Later that night, I pulled up an online map and marked the spots myself, including the gas station where Cooper walked into the dark. There was something like a curve to them, an almost deliberate line tracing the outer edges of Spokane, where city light surrendered to forest. I told myself I was being paranoid, that humans look for patterns everywhere, even where none exist. Then I remembered something from years before, back when we were still in high school and sneaking beers at an older kid's house. One of the guys who grew up nearer the county line talked about the tree line like it was something alive. How his grandfather warned him never to step into the woods alone after midnight, that there were places the trees learned your name if you got too close. We laughed it off as drunk superstition, but the words came back now, soft and insistent. The first time my phone rang at 11:47 p.m., I was half asleep on the couch. I glanced at the screen expecting spam. The number showed as unknown, just a string of digits with no name attached. The time burned brighter than it should have. 11:47, the last moment I saw Cooper walking under those harsh station lights. I answered, heart pounding against my ribs. There was no voice on the other end, no breathing. Just a soft rush that could have been wind threading through branches, punctuated by something else. A faint sound like someone counting under their breath and losing track halfway through. I said hello 3 times, the line went dead. The second week it happened again. Same time, same unknown number, same whispering rush. I recorded that one, played it back at full volume, then with headphones, then through audio software on my laptop, staring at the waveform as if it could explain anything. All it did was confirm the sound was real and not my imagination. The audio tech at work listened once and said it sounded like wind and maybe distant traffic. When I asked about the rhythmic spikes in the background, he shrugged. Could be someone whispering, could be interference. Hard to tell. It has been over a year now. The official word is still that Cooper is a missing adult who may have left on his own accord. Without a body, they will not say more. His family moved away last fall, the house too full of reminders. The calls still come, not every week now, but often enough that I cannot convince myself they are coincidence. Always at 11:47. Always that same rush of sound that feels colder than it should through a phone speaker. Sometimes, if I am honest, I think I hear my name in it, stretched thin and pulled apart by distance. I no longer walk near the woods at night. I cross the street to avoid even the small clusters of trees between apartment complexes. People say Spokane is surrounded by nature like it is a selling point. I used to love that, the way pine and river and sky framed everything. Now all I see is a border, a jagged line where something waits for you to step just far enough in that no one can see you turn around. I do not know what happened to Cooper that night. The rational part of me still reaches for explanations that fit into police reports and news segments. Abduction, mental break, an accident somewhere search teams missed. But there is another part, the one that wakes up a minute before my phone rings, staring at the dark window, counting my own breaths and hearing them answered by that distant whispering wind. That part is convinced the city has teeth, and somewhere beyond the gas stations and strip malls, the tree line is still remembering the shape of him walking toward it, hands in his pockets, head full of thoughts he never got the chance to share. The interrogation room at Spokane Police Plaza smelled like stale coffee and something metallic that I later realized was blood. I sat across from Detective Ramos watching the security monitor feed from interview room C, where Scarlet sat with her hands folded on the steel table. Her fingers were laced together so tightly the knuckles had gone white, and dried blood crusted under her nails in dark crescents. She wore a gray sweatshirt 3 sizes too big provided by the department after they bagged her clothes as evidence. Her hair hung in damp strings around her face, still wet from the attempt they had made to wash the worst of it off her in the holding area. She looked small under those fluorescent lights, almost childlike, except for her eyes. Those were calm. Too calm. Detective Ramos leaned forward, his voice low and patient. "Scarlet, can you tell us what happened tonight?" She did not answer right away, just stared at the two-way mirror like she could see straight through it into the observation room where I stood with 2 other detectives and a prosecutor who had been called in at 2 a.m. in the morning. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that same flat, measured tone I had heard dozens of times through the thin walls of our apartment building. "It was not me," she said. "It was the thing in apartment 4B that wears my face at night." The room went silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. Ramos exchanged a glance with his partner. Scarlet tilted her head, studying her own reflection in the mirror. "I know how that sounds, but I am telling you the truth. I do not remember doing it. I never remember what happens between midnight and dawn." I had moved into the building on Monroe Street in December of 2022, a 4-story brick structure built sometime in the 1940s with narrow hallways that always smelled faintly of mildew and old cooking oil. Rent was cheap enough that I did not ask too many questions about the water stains on the ceiling, or the way the radiators clanked like someone was hitting them with a wrench. Scarlet lived in 4B, directly across the hall from my unit. I met her the day I moved in, struggling with a box of books that had split at the bottom. She appeared in her doorway, barefoot and holding a paintbrush, and offered to help without saying much else. She was quiet in the way that made her easy to live near. No loud music, no visitors that I ever saw. Occasionally I would hear her moving around at odd hours, but the building was old and sound traveled strangely through the walls, so I never thought much of it. She worked from home, she told me once in the mailroom. Something with graphic design, freelance. Her apartment was her studio. I caught a glimpse inside one afternoon when she left her door propped open while carrying in groceries. Canvases leaned against every available wall, most of them unfinished, abstract shapes in blacks and deep reds that looked like they were trying to claw their way off the surface. The first time I heard her talking to herself was late January. I had gotten home from a double shift at the hospital around 11:30 p.m., exhausted enough that I fell asleep on the couch still wearing my scrubs. I woke up sometime after 1 to the sound of voices coming through the wall we shared. At first I thought she had the television on, but the rhythm was wrong. It sounded like a conversation. 2 people speaking in low tones, one voice slightly higher than the other, but both with the same cadence. I pressed my ear to the wall, curious now, and realized I could not make out words. Just the rise and fall of 2 distinct voices overlapping occasionally, like they were arguing or negotiating something. I saw Scarlet the next morning in the hallway. She looked tired. Dark circles under her eyes, but she smiled when she saw me and asked how my week was going. I almost mentioned the voices, but it felt invasive, like admitting I had been listening through the wall. So I said nothing. Over the next few weeks, I heard it again. Always late, always 2 voices. Once I thought I heard her laugh, but it did not sound like the quiet, polite laugh she used when we passed each other in the stairwell. This one was sharper, almost mocking. The building manager, a man named Victor who lived on the first floor and spent most of his time watching game shows in his undershirt, started complaining about Scarlet in early March. He cornered me one afternoon while I was checking my mail and asked if I had noticed anything strange coming from her apartment. I asked what he meant. He said tenants on the floor below had reported hearing footsteps at all hours, pacing back and forth like someone was walking laps. And then there were the birds. Dead birds, Victor said, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. Found them lined up outside her door twice now. 5 of them the first time, 7 the second. All the same kind. Sparrows, I think. Arranged in a row, heads all facing the same direction. He shook his head. I asked her about it. She said she did not know anything. Seemed genuinely confused, but who else would do something like that? I did not have an answer. I thought about saying it could be kids or someone trying to mess with her, but even as I thought it, I knew it sounded weak. Victor mentioned he had been keeping an eye on the security footage just to see if anyone was coming and going at odd hours. The building had one camera in the front lobby, old and grainy but functional enough to catch people entering and leaving. He pulled up the footage on his phone and showed me a clip from 2 nights prior. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m. Scarlet walked through the lobby toward the front door wearing a long coat and boots. She pushed through the door and disappeared off camera. Victor fast-forwarded. At 6:02 a.m. she came back in, same coat, same boots. Okay, I said, not seeing the problem yet. He kept scrolling. Now watch this. The timestamp jumped to 3:47 a.m., half an hour after the first exit. Scarlet walked through the lobby again, same coat, same boots, heading out the front door. My stomach dropped. Wait, I said, she left twice? Victor nodded grimly. But she only came back once, at least on camera. I checked the whole night. 2 exits, 1 entrance. Unless she came in through a window or the basement, which is locked, she should still be outside. But I saw her this morning. She was here, in her apartment. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. Maybe the camera glitched and duplicated footage. Maybe it was someone who looked like her. But the more I stared at the small screen, the more certain I became that it was her both times. Same walk, same slight hunch in her shoulders. Same hesitation before pushing the door open. Victor said he was going to talk to her, ask if she had been subletting or letting someone stay in her apartment without permission. It was against the lease. He seemed more annoyed than concerned, like this was just another headache in a building full of them. I did not see him again until 3 days later, and by then everything had changed. The night it happened, I was working a late shift and did not get home until almost 1 in the morning. The building was quiet, just the usual creaks and hums of old pipes settling. I unlocked my door and stepped inside, kicking off my shoes and heading straight for the shower. I was toweling off my hair when I heard a sound from the hallway. A door slamming, then raised voices. One of them was Victor, the other was Scarlet, but her voice sounded different. Louder, raw. I pulled on clothes and cracked my door open just enough to see down the hall. Victor stood outside Scarlet's apartment, gesturing with his hands like he was trying to explain something. Scarlet stood in her doorway, arms crossed, shaking her head. I live alone, she kept saying. I do not know what you are talking about. There is no one else here. You can come in and check if you want. Victor seemed to hesitate, but then nodded and stepped inside. I should have closed my door and gone to bed. I should have trusted that whatever was happening was between them and not my business. But something kept me standing there, watching the empty hallway, waiting. I do not know how long I stood there, 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then I heard Victor scream. It was not a shout or a yell, it was a scream, the kind that comes from pure animal terror, high-pitched and desperate. I ran into the hallway just as Scarlet stumbled out of her apartment, her hands covered in blood, her eyes wide and unfocused. She looked at me like she did not recognize me, like she was seeing straight through me to something else. Then she turned and ran toward the stairs. I pushed past her and looked inside the apartment. Victor was on the floor near the kitchenette, lying in a spreading pool of blood that looked black under the overhead light. His shirt was torn open, and I could see the wounds, too many to count, crossing his chest and stomach in jagged lines. A knife lay on the floor a few feet away, the blade slick and red. I do not remember calling 911. I do not remember what I said. I just remember standing there, staring, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Until I heard sirens outside. They found Scarlet in the bathroom at the end of the hall, locked inside, sitting in the empty tub with her knees pulled up to her chest. She did not resist when they broke down the door. She just looked up at the officers and said, "I do not remember. I do not remember any of it." The knife had her fingerprints all over it. So did the door handle, the wall, the light switch. Her clothes were soaked in Victor's blood. The apartment showed no signs of anyone else being there. No forced entry. No other footprints in the blood. Just hers. The forensics team worked through the night. I gave my statement to the police, told them everything I had seen and heard over the past few months. The voices, the birds, the security footage. They wrote it all down with expressions that told me they had already decided what this was. A mentally ill woman. A building manager who confronted her. A violent outburst. It happened all the time. But then the lead investigator pulled me aside and showed me something on his tablet. The preliminary autopsy report. Victor had been stabbed 47 times. The wounds were methodical, almost surgical in placement, avoiding major arteries at first to prolong suffering before the final strikes to the chest. The pattern suggested someone with anatomical knowledge, or at least a deliberate intent to make death slow. And then there was the other detail, the one that made the investigator's jaw tighten when he told me. They had found 2 sets of fingerprints on the knife. Both belonged to Scarlet. Same whorls, same ridge patterns. But the pressure points were different. One set showed the grip of someone holding the knife normally, fingers wrapped around the handle. The other set showed a reverse grip, thumb on the opposite side, like someone left-handed had used it. Scarlet was right-handed. They had checked. The trial was brief. Scarlet's public defender tried to argue diminished capacity, but the evidence was overwhelming. She was found in the locked bathroom with the victim's blood on her hands. The weapon was hers, taken from her own kitchen. There was no one else in the apartment. The jury took less than 4 hours to come back with a guilty verdict. The judge declared her mentally incompetent to stand sentencing and remanded her to Eastern State Hospital for psychiatric evaluation and indefinite treatment. I thought that would be the end of it. But 2 weeks after the sentencing, a detective I had never met showed up at my door. He said his name was Alvarez, and he was working cold cases for the county. He wanted to know if Scarlet had ever mentioned anything about her past, any places she had lived before Monroe Street, any friends or family. I told him I barely knew her. We had only ever exchanged pleasantries. He nodded like he expected that answer, then pulled out a folder from his bag. Inside were crime scene photos from 6 different unsolved homicides in Spokane over the past 8 years. All of them showed the same pattern. Victims stabbed multiple times with methodical precision. No signs of forced entry, no clear motive. And in each case, there were witnesses who reported seeing the suspect leave the scene, but the descriptions varied wildly. Different heights, different builds. The only consistent detail was that the suspect always seemed calm, almost detached, like they were watching themselves from a distance. Alvarez said Scarlet had been living in Spokane the entire time, moving from apartment to apartment every year or so, always staying just under the radar. During her psychiatric evaluation, she had started talking about the murders, describing crime scenes she should not have known anything about, providing details that had never been released to the public. When the doctors asked how she knew these things, she said the same thing she had said in the interrogation room. It was not her. It was the thing that wore her face between midnight and dawn. I asked if they believed her. Alvarez closed the folder and stood up. "It does not matter what we believe," he said. "She is in custody. The killings have stopped. That is all that matters." But the way he said it, the slight hesitation before the last sentence, told me he was not sure. Told me that somewhere deep down he had looked at those crime scene photos and those impossible fingerprints and wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something they were missing. Something that did not fit into police reports or courtroom testimony. I moved out of the building a month later. Found a place on the other side of town, farther north, where the buildings were newer and the walls did not carry voices. But sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, I think about Scarlet sitting in that hospital room, staring at the walls, waiting for the sun to rise. I think about the thing she said wore her face, and I wonder if it is still waiting, somewhere in the space between midnight and dawn, looking for another door to step through, another face to borrow, another set of hands to wrap around a knife. I do not know if I believe her. But I know I check my locks twice now before bed, and I never ever open my door after midnight. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, interrupting the usual flow of traffic reports and weather updates with a breaking alert that made everyone in the office stop mid-conversation. SWAT team executes search warrant on South Hill residence. 7 bodies recovered from basement. Suspect in custody. The address flashed across the screen and I felt my coffee cup slip from my hand, hitting the desk and spilling in a dark wave across my keyboard. I knew that address. I had been inside that house exactly 3 times. The suspect was identified an hour later as Archie Watson, 41, resident of Spokane for the past 9 years, employed at Summit Insurance Group as a claims adjuster. He worked 2 cubicles down from me. We had shared the same office space for 4 years. He brought donuts every Friday without fail, always remembered birthdays, and kept a small collection of houseplants on his desk that he watered with the kind of care most people reserved for pets. When the company photo went up on the website last year, Archie stood in the back row smiling that mild, forgettable smile, hands clasped in front of him like he was posing for a church directory. Nobody believed it at first. There had to be a mistake, wrong address, wrong person, someone with a similar name. But then the photos started circulating online, pulled from news helicopters hovering over the property, and there was no mistaking the blue 2-story house with the wraparound porch and the carefully maintained garden beds that Archie mentioned tending every weekend. The police had cordoned off the entire block. Forensics vans lined the street. Investigators in white suits carried evidence boxes up from the basement entrance, and even from the grainy aerial footage, you could see how many boxes there were. I met Archie my second week at Summit. He helped me figure out the filing system, showed me where the good coffee machine was hidden on the 3rd floor, and offered tips on which managers to avoid when you needed time off. He spoke in the same measured tone he used for everything, never raising his voice, never showing much emotion beyond polite interest. His desk was the neatest in the office, files organized by color-coded tabs, pens arranged by type in a small ceramic holder his sister had made, or so he said. He never talked about family beyond that. No parents, no spouse, just the occasional mention of a sister who lived out of state and sent him things for holidays. The first time I rode with Archie was during a particularly brutal winter storm in January 2020. My car would not start, and he offered to drop me home since we lived in vaguely the same direction. His car was as neat as his desk. Not a single receipt or food wrapper. No dust on the dashboard. The trunk, visible when he popped it to grab an ice scraper, contained a carefully folded tarp, bungee cords, a toolbox, and several heavy-duty zip ties bundled together with a rubber band. He noticed me looking and laughed, that soft, forgettable laugh. "Moving supplies," he said. "Been helping my sister clean out her garage. You would not believe how much junk accumulates over the years." I thought nothing of it. People kept strange things in their cars. I had jumper cables and a broken umbrella rolling around in my back seat for 6 months. We drove in comfortable silence, and he dropped me at my apartment with a wave and a reminder to text him if I needed a ride the next day. He was helpful like that, always offering, always available, never pushy. The dinner party happened 8 months later in September, right after the company finished a massive project and everyone was riding the high of success and end-of-year bonuses. Archie sent out an email inviting the team to his place for a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just food and drinks and a chance to relax outside the office. 6 of us showed up, including me, carrying bottles of wine and store-bought appetizers. The house was exactly what you would expect from Archie. Clean, organized. Furniture that looked comfortable but not expensive. Framed landscape photos on the walls, the kind you buy at department stores. Everything neutral and inoffensive. We ate on the back patio as the sun set, talking about work and weekend plans and the upcoming holidays. Around 8:30, someone asked to use the bathroom. Archie directed them to the one upstairs, saying the main floor one had a plumbing issue he was waiting to get fixed. I noticed the basement door in the hallway when I went to refill my drink. It was the only door in the house with visible locks. 3 of them, deadbolts installed at different heights, the metal still shiny and new-looking against the old wood frame. I asked about it when I came back outside, keeping my tone light, curious but not accusatory. Archie glanced at the house, then back at me. "Old house problems," he said. "Foundation settling. Door does not hang right anymore. Had to seal it up to keep the draft out. Winter gets cold down there." It was a reasonable answer, the kind of answer that made sense in the moment, surrounded by co-workers and the pleasant hum of conversation. But later, driving home, I kept thinking about those 3 deadbolts, about how they were installed on the outside of the door, not the inside. About how you do not usually need 3 separate locks to keep out a draft. The missing person posters started appearing in October. A woman named Jessica, 32, last seen leaving a coffee shop in downtown Spokane after meeting someone for a first date. The photo showed her smiling, dark hair pulled back, wearing the kind of casual outfit you pick when you want to look nice but not too formal. The posters went up everywhere, taped to light poles, pinned to community boards, shared thousands of times on social media. I saw Archie looking at one in the break room, his head tilted slightly, reading the description with the same mild interest he showed when reviewing insurance claims. "Terrible thing," he said when he noticed me standing there. "You hear about these cases and always think it will not happen here. But Spokane is not as safe as people want to believe." He threw his coffee cup in the trash and walked back to his desk. Later that week, I overheard him on a phone call during lunch, his voice drifting over the cubicle wall. He was talking about dating apps, how difficult it was to meet genuine people, how everyone presented a false version of themselves online. "You think you know someone after a few messages," he said, "but you do not really know them until you spend time together. Real time. Uninterrupted." The hardware store encounter happened in late February, just 2 weeks before the raid. I was picking up paint supplies for my bathroom renovation when I saw Archie in the cleaning aisle. His cart was full of industrial drain cleaner, not 1 or 2 bottles, 12 of them. Heavy-duty commercial-grade stuff that came with warning labels about chemical burns and ventilation requirements. He saw me before I could turn around, and his face did that thing it always did. shifting into a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Spring cleaning," he said, gesturing at the cart. "Old pipes, decades of buildup, needs aggressive treatment or the whole system backs up." I nodded, said something about my own plumbing issues, and got out of there as fast as I could without seeming rude. But my hands shook the entire drive home. I kept thinking about the basement door with 3 locks, about the missing woman whose poster was still hanging in the break room, about the careful way Archie folded tarps in his trunk. When the news broke, when they found 7 bodies preserved in that basement, when they revealed he had been killing for 6 years, selecting victims from dating apps and luring them to his house with promises of dinner and conversation, I was not surprised. I was horrified, sickened, but not surprised. The details came out slowly over the following weeks. How he had converted the basement into a workshop. How he documented everything in journals, treating each victim like a project with measurable outcomes. How he kept them there after death, using chemicals to slow decomposition, arranging them in specific positions, visiting them regularly like they were still alive and waiting for him. The trial was over by June. Archie cooperated with everything, showed no emotion when they presented photos from the basement, confirmed details about victims the police had not yet identified, spoke about his process like he was describing how to file an insurance claim, methodical and thorough. During sentencing, he looked directly at the gallery where office co-workers sat in stunned silence, and thanked me by name for never asking too many questions, for making it easy to maintain his routine without suspicion. His lawyer objected. The judge sustained it. But those words hung in the courtroom like smoke. I quit Summit 2 days after the sentencing, could not walk past his empty desk without seeing him there, watering those plants, smiling that mild smile. I moved to a different part of the city, changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts. But the letters still find me, forwarded through some system I do not understand. Always the same handwriting, neat and precise, always describing the other inmates like specimens in a collection. Their habits, their crimes, their potential. He signs them the same way every time. Your former colleague, Archie. I do not open them anymore. I burn them in the kitchen sink and wash the ashes down the drain. But they keep coming, regular as those Friday donuts reminders that for 4 years I sat 2 cubicles away from someone who treated human lives like projects to be completed and filed away. And the worst part, the part that wakes me up at 3 a.m. in the morning staring at the ceiling, is knowing that if I had asked more questions, if I had trusted that instinct in the hardware store or at the dinner party, maybe some of those 7 people would still be alive. Maybe I could have stopped him before the collection was complete. I found Community Covenant Fellowship in July 2020 during the worst summer of my life, when everything that could go wrong had already happened and I was looking for anything that felt like solid ground. The divorce papers had been signed in May. My mother died in June. I lost my job at the marketing firm 2 weeks later during their pandemic restructuring. 32 years old and living in a studio apartment in Spokane Valley with nothing but a futon, a microwave, and a growing certainty that I had made every wrong choice possible since graduating college. When my neighbor mentioned a new church meeting in a converted warehouse on Trent Avenue, I went mostly because it gave me somewhere to be on a Sunday morning that was not staring at the water-stained ceiling counting my failures. The warehouse sat between an auto body shop and a storage facility, the kind of industrial block where businesses came and went without anyone noticing. A hand-painted sign out front read Community Covenant Fellowship in careful letters. And below that in smaller script, all are welcome, all are seen. The inside had been cleaned up but not renovated, concrete floors, exposed ductwork. Folding chairs arranged in loose rows facing a small platform where a woman in a simple gray dress stood waiting. That was Matilda King. She was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled into a low bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything about you in a single glance. When she smiled at me, it was not the plastic smile of someone performing hospitality. It felt genuine, like she had been waiting specifically for me to walk through that door. There were about 30 people there that first morning, scattered across the chairs in small clusters. Everyone looked damaged in some visible way. A man in his 50s with a neck brace and haunted eyes. A young woman with fresh track marks barely hidden by her sleeves. An older couple holding hands so tight their knuckles showed white. Matilda did not preach in the traditional sense. She spoke in a low, conversational tone about pain and how the world taught us to run from it instead of understanding it. Suffering is not punishment, she said. It is communication. Your body speaking truths your mind refuses to hear. And until you learn to listen, until you stop numbing and start feeling, you will never be free. I cried during that first service. I could not help it. Something about the way she talked about suffering like it had purpose made the past 3 months feel less like random cruelty and more like something I could survive. Afterward, people stayed and talked, shared coffee from a cheap machine someone had set up on a folding table. Matilda moved through the small crowd, touching shoulders, listening with complete attention when people spoke, never rushing anyone or offering easy answers. When she got to me, she took both my hands and said, "You have been carrying something heavy for a long time. I can see it in the way you stand. We can help you put it down." The first month felt like healing. We met 3 times a week, then 5, then every evening as Matilda introduced what she called integration sessions, where we would sit in small groups and talk about our pain points, mapping them on our bodies, learning to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing it. She taught breathing exercises, guided meditations, journaling practices that forced you to confront the narratives you had been telling yourself. It was intense and uncomfortable and exactly what I thought I needed. The group grew tighter. People started staying after sessions to help clean the warehouse, to set up chairs, to cook simple meals we would share. Matilda called us her fellowship, and the word felt right, like we belonged to something larger than our individual suffering. The fasting started in August. Matilda called it cleansing, explaining that our bodies held toxins not just from food but from trauma, that we needed to empty ourselves before we could fill back up with anything healthy. "The body is too loud," she said, "always demanding, always distracting. Hunger teaches discipline, teaches you to separate need from want." We started with 1 day a week, just water and herbal tea. It was hard, but Matilda fasted with us, and there was something powerful about shared deprivation. By September, we were fasting 3 days a week. By October, it was 5. People lost weight rapidly. I dropped 15 pounds in 6 weeks. My co-worker at the temp job I had picked up asked if I was sick. I told her I was finally getting healthy. The isolation exercises came next. Matilda explained that modern life overloaded our senses, that we needed periods of complete separation from stimulus to truly hear ourselves. She sectioned off part of the warehouse with heavy curtains, creating small individual spaces barely larger than closets. We would spend hours in there alone, sitting in darkness, no phone, no books, nothing but our thoughts and the sound of our own breathing. "This is where healing lives," Matilda said, "in the quiet, in the spaces between the noise." Some people lasted 30 minutes before needing out. Others, like me, found something almost peaceful in it. The darkness stopped feeling like punishment and started feeling like safety. By November, most of us were living at the warehouse. It happened gradually. Someone would mention they could not afford rent, and Matilda would offer them space in the back room. Then another person, then another. I gave up my studio in early December, telling myself it was practical. Why pay for an apartment I barely used when I spent 16 hours a day at the fellowship anyway? Matilda helped me move my few belongings in her truck. She did not own much herself, she said. Material attachment was another form of distraction from the real work of transformation. Living there meant the boundaries dissolved completely. We woke together, fasted together, meditated for hours in those dark isolation spaces. Matilda began teaching about purification through surrender, about how the ego clung to identity documents and legal names and social connections as shields against true change. "Your past is not who you are," she said during a midnight session where we all sat in a circle barely visible in the dim candlelight. "It is a story you have been telling that keeps you trapped. To be free, you must burn the story." She passed around a metal trash can and asked us to bring anything that tied us to our old lives. Identification cards, birth certificates, family photographs. I watched people drop them in one by one, some crying, some laughing with a kind of manic relief. When the can reached me, I hesitated. My driver's license felt heavy in my hand. Matilda watched me, patient and still, and said, "What are you protecting? The person who failed? The person who suffered? Why do you want to keep being her?" I dropped it in. We burned everything that night, the smoke acrid and thick, and Matilda led us in chanting about release and rebirth until our voices went hoarse. The final purification was announced on a cold Thursday night in late January. We gathered in the main space, everyone exhausted from weeks of fasting and isolation, our bodies thin and our minds floating in that strange space between clarity and delirium. Matilda stood on the platform holding a large glass pitcher filled with dark liquid. "This is the last barrier," she said. "The body fears death because it does not understand transcendence. Tonight we prove we are stronger than that fear. Tonight we drink, and we transform, and we awaken in forms that cannot be broken by the world." She poured the liquid into small paper cups, moving through the crowd, handing them out with the reverence of communion. People took them without question. The trust was absolute. I held mine and looked at the dark surface, catching the candlelight. Something in my brain, some small part that had not been worn down by months of fasting and isolation, screamed at me to stop. I raised the cup to my lips. The smell hit me first, sweet and chemical, wrong. I recognized it from a training session at my old job about workplace safety. Antifreeze. I lowered the cup and looked around. Others were already drinking, tilting their heads back, swallowing obediently. I stood up fast enough that my chair clattered backward. Matilda's eyes locked on mine across the room. Her expression did not change. "Sit down," she said, voice still calm. "You are afraid. That is natural. But fear is the last thing we release." I shook my head. People around me were staring, some confused, some with that glazed look of complete devotion. A man to my left drained his cup and smiled at me. "It tastes like salvation," he whispered. I backed toward the door. Matilda moved to block me, still holding the pitcher. "You were not ready," she said softly. "I thought you were, but you are still clinging, still trapped." I shoved past her and ran. Out of the warehouse, into the parking lot. My hands shook so hard I could barely dial 911 on the phone I had hidden in my sleeping bag weeks ago. The one rule I had broken, the one thread connecting me to the outside world. The operator answered and I screamed the address, screamed that people were being poisoned, screamed until I heard sirens cutting through the night air. Police and paramedics arrived within 10 minutes. 14 people died before they could be treated. 8 survived with permanent organ damage. Matilda was gone. The back door stood open, her truck missing from the lot. They found her office cleared out, bank accounts emptied, no trace of where she went. Investigation revealed she had done this before, 3 times in 3 different states over 7 years. Different names, different churches, always the same pattern of isolation and control building toward mass casualties. Her real name, if she had one, remained unknown. Fingerprints matched no database. Survivors described her face differently, like memory could not hold her features steady. I spent 6 months in therapy learning words like cult deprogramming and trauma bonding, learning how isolation and fasting and sleep deprivation could break down your ability to think critically, learning that what felt like healing was actually dissolution. The therapist said I was lucky. I told her I did not feel lucky. I felt like a coward who ran while others died believing they were transforming. The postcards started arriving a year later. No return address. Postmarked from different cities. Boise, Missoula, Portland. Each one blank except for a single sentence in careful handwriting. You were not ready. I know she is still out there, gathering people like me, damaged and desperate and looking for meaning in their suffering. Teaching them to fast, to isolate, to surrender. Building toward the night she brings out the pitcher and asks them to prove their devotion. And I know that somewhere someone is drinking from that cup right now, believing they are choosing transcendence when they are really just choosing death. The first time Riley came into the bookstore, I barely noticed. It was a Tuesday in September 2019, slow enough that I had been reorganizing the mystery section for something to do, and they walked in wearing a faded jacket and carrying a worn leather bag over one shoulder. They browsed for maybe 20 minutes, running fingers along spines, pulling books out to read back covers, eventually bringing a paperback copy of a Tana French novel to the counter. I rang it up, asked if they wanted a receipt, and that should have been the end of it. Just another customer in a rotation of faces I saw once and forgot immediately. But Riley came back the next Tuesday. Same time, around 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch rush had cleared and before the after-work crowd started filtering in. They brought the Tana French book back to the counter and asked what else I would recommend. I suggested a few titles, pulled one off the shelf behind me, and they bought it without hesitation. We talked for maybe 5 minutes about mysteries, about how the best ones were less about solving the crime and more about understanding the people tangled up in it. Riley nodded along, agreeing in that easy way people do when they are genuinely listening. They left with the book tucked in their bag and a small wave goodbye. It became routine over the next few weeks. Every Tuesday afternoon, Riley would come in. We would talk about what they had read. I would suggest something new. They would buy it. The conversation stretched longer each time. 10 minutes, 15. Once we talked for almost half an hour about the difference between Scandinavian noir and American crime fiction. And I did not even notice the time passing until my manager gave me a pointed look from across the store. Riley was easy to talk to, thoughtful, never pushy. They remembered details from previous conversations and asked follow-up questions that showed they had actually thought about what I said. It felt nice to be listened to like that. In October, Riley mentioned they had tried a coffee shop I had recommended a few weeks earlier. I did not remember recommending any coffee shop, but I mentioned a lot of places in passing, so I figured I must have. They said they had loved it, that I had good taste, that I should trust my instincts more. A week later, I stopped by that same coffee shop after work and saw Riley sitting at a corner table. They looked up, waved, and I walked over to say hello. We ended up talking for an hour about books in Spokane and how the city felt smaller every year. It was comfortable, easy. When I got up to leave, Riley mentioned they would probably be there again next Wednesday if I wanted company during my afternoon break. I said maybe, keeping it non-committal, and left feeling slightly unsettled in a way I could not name. November brought the first note. I found it tucked inside a used hardcover someone had traded in, a book I was shelving when the small piece of paper fell out. My name was written at the top in careful handwriting I recognized from the receipts Riley signed. Below it, "Noticed you wore your hair different today. The way it catches the light by the window makes you look like you are standing in a photograph, like you are not quite part of the rest of the room." I read it twice, trying to decide if it was sweet or strange. I had not told Riley my name beyond what was printed on my employee badge, and they had been observing me closely enough to notice my hair. I told myself it was a compliment. People noticed things about people they liked. It was harmless. The second note came a week later, folded into the pages of a thriller Riley had returned. This one detailed my routine, what time I arrived at work, how long my lunch breaks lasted, that I always bought the same sandwich from the deli 3 doors down, that I walked home instead of driving. The tone was still friendly, almost affectionate, but the specificity made my stomach turn. I confronted Riley the next Tuesday when they came in. Kept my voice light, asked if they had been leaving notes in the books. Riley looked confused at first, then smiled. "Just wanted you to know someone sees you," they said. "This job you probably feel invisible most of the time. I thought you should know you are not." I should have set a boundary right there. Should have said it made me uncomfortable, but I was afraid of being rude, of overreacting, of making a scene. So I laughed it off and said it was a little strange, but I appreciated the thought. Riley nodded, bought their book, and left. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. By December, Riley was everywhere, not just Tuesdays at the bookstore. They were at the coffee shop every time I stopped in, walking on the same street when I headed home, standing across from my apartment building when I looked out my window at night. I told myself it was coincidence. Spokane was not that big. People crossed paths. But the notes kept coming, and they were no longer tucked in books. They appeared in my coat pocket at work, slipped under my apartment door. One showed up in my mailbox, which meant Riley knew exactly where I lived, knew which unit was mine in a building with 40 apartments. The photographs were what finally broke through my denial. I came home from work on a cold Thursday in January to find a manila envelope leaning against my door. No postage, no return address. Just my name written in that same careful handwriting. Inside were printed photos, dozens of them. Me walking to work, me sitting in the window of the coffee shop, me standing in my apartment with the curtains open, unaware I was being watched. Some of the photos were weeks old, judging by what I was wearing. Riley had been documenting me for months, building some kind of archive of my existence without my knowledge or permission. I filed a restraining order the next morning, brought the photos and notes to the Spokane County Courthouse, and filled out the paperwork with shaking hands. The clerk processed it without much emotion, like this happened every day, which I suppose it did. The judge granted a temporary order and scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks later. I thought having the legal protection would help. Instead, it made things worse. Riley showed up at the courthouse the day the order was served. I was walking to my car when I saw them standing by the entrance, holding the papers, reading them with an expression I could not decipher. They looked up and our eyes met. I fumbled with my keys, got the car door open, and locked it immediately. Riley walked over slowly, not threatening, just purposeful, and stood next to my window. "This is a misunderstanding," they said, voice muffled through the glass. "We have something real. You feel it too. I know you do. This is just fear of what we could be together." I called 911 from the parking lot. Riley stayed there talking to my window, explaining in calm detail how they had been watching over me, protecting me, learning everything about me so we could skip past the awkward early stages of a relationship and go straight to deep understanding. "I know you better than anyone," they said. "I have studied you. I know how you take your coffee. I know you bite your bottom lip when you are thinking. I know you look at the moon every night before you close your curtains. We are supposed to be together." Police arrived and escorted Riley away from my car. They were arrested 2 days later after breaking into my apartment. I had stayed with a friend that night, something instinctive telling me not to be alone. The landlord called at 4 a.m. in the morning to say someone had triggered the building alarm. Police found Riley inside my unit, sitting on my bed, surrounded by printed photographs they had taped to every wall. Hundreds of them, creating a collage that covered the space floor to ceiling. In the center, directly above my pillow, was a photo of me sleeping. I had never seen that photo before. Did not know it existed. Riley had been inside before, watching me while I was unconscious and vulnerable. The trial moved quickly. Breaking and entering, stalking, assault because Riley had cut me with a box cutter during the struggle when police tried to remove them from my apartment. A shallow slice across my forearm that required 12 stitches. The psychiatric evaluation revealed obsessive delusional disorder. Riley genuinely believed we were in a relationship, that my resistance was fear of destiny rather than rejection. They had journals documenting an entire imagined romance spanning years, conversations we never had, dates we never went on, a whole alternate reality where I loved them back. The sentencing hearing was in March. 8 years with possibility of parole after 5, mandatory psychiatric treatment, no contact order extending beyond the prison term. Riley cried during the sentencing, not from regret, but from grief. She was mine, they told the judge. She just did not know it yet. I was patient, I was careful, I did everything right. The judge explained that was not how relationships worked, that love required consent and mutual participation, but Riley just shook their head like the judge was the one who did not understand. I moved to Seattle 6 weeks later. Changed my name legally, left no forwarding address, deleted every social media account, and started over with a manufactured history. The bookstore closed 3 months after the incident, not because of what happened, but because downtown foot traffic had been declining for years, and this was the final push the owner needed to get out. The space became a coffee shop, then that closed too, and now it sits empty with soap-covered windows and a for-lease sign nobody calls about. Riley was released on parole in October 2023. I only know because a victim advocate I had worked with called to tell me. They said Riley had completed the treatment program, shown appropriate remorse, and would be monitored closely. They also said Riley's current location was unknown, that they had checked in with their parole officer once, and then disappeared. There was a warrant out, but resources were limited and Riley was not considered high priority. "Just be careful," the advocate said before hanging up. "Keep your doors locked. Vary your routine. Trust your instincts. I do those things now. I also look over my shoulder when I walk. I check my car before getting in. I keep my curtains closed always, even during the day. Sometimes I think I see Riley in crowds. Same jacket, same leather bag, same focused stare. But when I look again, it is just a stranger who happens to share a few features, and I am left standing there trying to decide if I am being paranoid or appropriately cautious. The line between those two things has become impossible to see." My father went into Sacred Heart Medical Center for what should have been a routine procedure in February 2018. Gallbladder removal, laparoscopic. The surgeon said he would be home in 3 days, back to normal in 2 weeks, and we treated it like an inconvenience rather than a crisis. I drove him to the hospital on a Wednesday morning, kissed his forehead before they wheeled him into the operating room, and sat in the waiting area drinking terrible coffee while scrolling through my phone. The surgery went perfectly. No complications. The surgeon came out smiling, told me everything looked good, and said my father would be moved to a recovery room within the hour. That was when he was assigned to Zara Phillips. She was the night shift nurse covering his floor, and when I met her during evening visiting hours, she seemed competent and kind. Maybe 30 years old, with her dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail and scrubs that looked freshly pressed despite being 8 hours into her shift. She explained his medication schedule, showed me how to adjust his bed if he needed it, and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had done this thousands of times. Other nurses on the floor praised her when I asked. "Zara is one of our best," the floor supervisor said. "Always volunteers for the overnight shifts. Patients love her." The first night passed without incident. I stayed until visiting hours ended at 9, then drove home and tried to sleep. My phone rang at 2:30 in the morning. It was my father, his voice tight with pain. He said something was wrong, that his incision site was burning, that the pain medication was not working. I told him to call the nurse. He said he already had. Zara had come in, checked his vitals, adjusted something on his IV, and told him it was normal post-surgical discomfort. But his voice told me it was more than that. I was back at the hospital by 3, navigating empty hallways that felt too bright and too quiet. My father was curled on his side when I walked in, his face gray and slick with sweat. Zara stood next to his bed making notes on a tablet. She looked up when I entered and gave me a calm smile. "He is doing fine," she said. "Pain is part of healing. We want to avoid over-medicating." I asked what she had given him. She listed medications I did not recognize, rattling off dosages with the ease of someone reciting a grocery list. I did not know enough to question her, so I sat with my father and held his hand until the pain subsided enough for him to fall into a restless sleep. The pattern repeated over the next week. During the day, my father seemed stable, uncomfortable but recovering. Then night would come, and by midnight his pain would spike to unbearable levels. I started staying through the night, sleeping in the stiff chair next to his bed. Zara was always there during the worst episodes, always taking notes, always adjusting medications, and always speaking in that same calm, measured tone. "Pain tolerance varies widely between patients," she explained one night while my father writhed in his bed. "I am documenting his responses. It helps us understand how to manage future cases." Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl. The clinical detachment. The way she watched him suffer with the focused interest of someone observing an experiment rather than caring for a patient. I mentioned it to the day shift nurse, a woman named Claire who had been working at Sacred Heart for 15 years. She frowned and said she would look into it, but nothing changed. The nights continued. The pain continued. My father, who had walked into the hospital strong and healthy, was deteriorating in ways that made no medical sense. By the 3rd week, another patient in the same ward started having similar problems. An older man recovering from hip surgery who screamed through the nights begging for relief that never came. I saw Zara moving between rooms, attending to both of them with that same careful attention, always making notes, always adjusting medications. I started watching her more closely. The way she would check the medication chart, then pull vials from her pocket instead of the supply card. The way she would inject something into IV lines when she thought no one was looking. The way she would pause after administering medication and wait, watching like she was timing a reaction. I started taking photos of the medication chart with my phone when Zara was not around, documenting what was listed versus what I saw her actually give. The discrepancies were small at first, dosages off by fractions, medications given at times not recorded. But as I compared the photos over several days, a pattern emerged. My father was receiving significantly different medication than what was documented. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes substances that were not listed on his chart at all. I brought the photos to the hospital administration on a Monday morning, sat in an office with beige walls and fluorescent lights while a patient advocate and a senior nurse reviewed the images on my phone. Their expressions shifted from skepticism to concern to barely concealed horror as they cross-referenced my photos with the official records. An internal investigation was launched that afternoon. Zara was placed on administrative leave pending review. My father was transferred to a different floor under the care of different nurses. Within 48 hours, his condition began to improve. The investigation took 3 months. What they found was worse than anyone anticipated. Zara had been systematically giving patients incorrect medication doses for nearly 2 years. Not enough to kill, but enough to cause significant suffering. She kept personal journals at home, recovered during a search warrant that documented everything. Patient names, pain responses rated on a scale of 1 to 10, detailed observations about how long each person could endure before breaking down completely. Notes about which medications produced the most interesting reactions. She treated the hospital like a laboratory and her patients like test subjects. 23 patients were identified as victims over the 2-year period. Most had recovered and been discharged, unaware that their prolonged suffering had been intentional. 2 deaths were flagged for review. An elderly woman who had died from complications that might have been prevented with proper medication. A middle-aged man whose heart had stopped during what should have been a stable recovery. The medical examiner could not definitively prove Zara's interference had caused their deaths, but the timing and her documented presence during their final hours raised enough questions that the cases were referred to the district attorney. The trial began in November. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery with other victims and their families, watching Zara sit at the defense table in clothes that made her look smaller and younger than she was. Her lawyer argued mental illness, argued she had been suffering from untreated obsessive-compulsive disorder that manifested as a need to control and document patient outcomes, argued she needed treatment, not prison. The prosecution presented her journals as evidence, page after page of clinical observations written in neat handwriting. Patient 7 displayed increased pain threshold after 3rd night of reduced dosage. Noted ability to maintain consciousness despite distress. Interesting how the body adapts when the mind believes help is coming. She showed no remorse during her testimony. Spoke about her actions like she was defending a research project. I was trying to understand human pain tolerance, she said. Medical literature gives us averages, but averages do not account for individual variation. I was collecting real data that could have advanced our understanding of pain management if anyone had bothered to see the value in it. The prosecutor asked if she understood that she had tortured people. Zara paused, considered the question, then said, "Torture implies intent to harm. I intended to learn." The jury convicted her on 19 counts of assault and reckless endangerment. The 2 deaths could not be proven beyond reasonable doubt. She was sentenced to 15 years with possibility of parole after 10. Her medical license was permanently revoked. During the sentencing hearing, the judge asked if she had anything to say to her victims. Zara looked directly at my father, who sat hunched in the front row, still bearing the physical and psychological scars of those weeks, and said, "Your suffering contributed to knowledge. That should mean something." My father survived, but something in him changed permanently. He cannot enter a hospital without panic attacks. The sound of IV pumps makes him shake. He stopped trusting doctors, stopped taking medication even when he needed it, and developed an anxiety disorder that requires therapy he can barely afford. I quit my job in Spokane and moved closer to him, checking in daily, helping him navigate the world that now feels hostile and dangerous. We do not talk about Zara often, but sometimes late at night he will call me and ask if I think she is still out there. If someone else is suffering in a hospital bed while a nurse stands over them taking notes, documenting their pain with clinical detachment, treating their agony like data to be collected and filed away. I tell him no. I tell him she is in prison where she belongs. But I know what he is really asking. He is asking if evil like that can be contained. If someone who views human suffering as an experiment can ever truly be rehabilitated. If the kind of curiosity that drives a person to deliberately hurt others in the name of understanding can be treated, or if it just waits, patient and methodical, for the next opportunity to continue the work. I do not have answers. All I know is that every time I see a hospital, I think about those journals. About 23 people who suffered because one person wanted to know exactly how much pain a human being could endure before breaking. And I wonder how many others are out there wearing scrubs and smiling calmly, asking themselves the same question. The Craigslist ad appeared on a Sunday in November 2017, buried among posts for restaurant servers and retail associates. Warehouse inventory position, immediate start, above market pay, flexible schedule, no experience necessary. I had been unemployed for 4 months, watching my savings evaporate while sending out dozens of applications that disappeared into automated rejection emails. The ad did not list a company name, just a phone number and an address in the industrial district off Freya Street. I called before I could talk myself out of it. A man answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and professional. He said his name was Ashton Wallace, that he ran an import-export operation, and that he could interview me the next day if I was available. The warehouse sat at the end of a gravel lot surrounded by chain-link fence, wedged between a defunct lumberyard and a building that used to manufacture auto parts before the company relocated to Idaho. From the outside, it looked legitimate. Metal siding, loading docks, a small office attached to the front with blinds covering the windows. Ashton met me at the door wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, looking more like a middle manager than someone who worked in a warehouse. He was maybe 40, clean-shaven, with the kind of forgettable face you would pass on the street without noticing. He shook my hand firmly and led me inside. The interview lasted 15 minutes. He asked basic questions about my work history, whether I could lift 50 pounds if I had reliable transportation. I answered honestly, trying not to sound desperate even though we both knew I was. He explained the job involved managing inventory for imported goods, mostly textiles and small electronics that came through the port of Seattle and got distributed to retailers across the Northwest. The pay was $18 an hour, cash with potential for overtime. When I asked why cash, he said it simplified payroll for workers who had complicated tax situations and assured me it was all above board. I needed the money badly enough that I did not push further. I started the next day. Ashton gave me a brief tour, showing me rows of metal shelving stacked with cardboard boxes, a small break room with a microwave and coffee maker, and a back area he said was residential space for employees who wanted the convenience of living on site. Completely optional, he said. But the rent in Spokane keeps going up. Some people appreciate having the option. I noticed people moving through the warehouse, maybe a dozen of them, all avoiding eye contact. They worked with their heads down, moving boxes in silence, and when I tried to say hello to a woman restocking a shelf, she flinched and hurried away. The first week felt off in ways I could not articulate. The work itself was straightforward. Log inventory, move boxes, update spreadsheets on an old desktop computer in the corner. But the atmosphere was wrong. Nobody talked. Nobody took breaks together. Everyone moved with the cautious efficiency of people trying not to be noticed. Ashton was always present, watching from his office or walking the floor with a clipboard, making notes, occasionally speaking to workers in Spanish or what I later learned was Tagalog. I asked one of the guys I worked near, a younger man who looked barely 20, where everyone was from. He stared at me for a long moment, then returned to his work without answering. By the second week, I realized the residential area was not optional. Workers lived there full time. I saw them in the morning emerging from a door at the back of the warehouse, wearing the same clothes they had worn the day before, heading to a communal bathroom with towels over their shoulders. They ate meals together at folding tables in what had been a storage room, cooking on hot plates and sharing food from bulk containers. None of them ever left the property, not for groceries, not for errands, not at all. When I asked Ashton about it, he said most of his employees were undocumented or recovering from difficult situations and preferred to keep a low profile. "I provide stability," he said, "a place to work and live without judgment. Most people appreciate that." The incident that broke my willful ignorance happened on a Thursday afternoon. A man tried to leave. He walked toward the front door during what I assumed was his break, moving with purpose, and Ashton appeared from nowhere. "Where are you going?" His voice was still calm, still professional, but with an edge underneath. The man said something in Spanish, gesturing toward the street. Ashton responded in the same language, too fast for me to catch more than a few words. The man shook his head and reached for the door handle. Two other men materialized from the back, larger and broader, and physically pulled him away from the exit. They were not gentle. The man shouted, struggled, and was dragged toward the residential area while I stood frozen behind a stack of boxes. Ashton noticed me watching. He walked over, hands in his pockets, expression unchanged. "Sometimes people panic," he said. "They get overwhelmed and forget they have obligations. We help them remember. Nobody gets hurt as long as everyone follows the agreements they made." I asked what agreements. He smiled thinly. "Everyone here owes something. Time, money, safe passage. I provide a service, and in exchange they work off their debt. It is a fair arrangement." The way he said it, like he genuinely believed his own justification, made my stomach turn. That night I waited until the warehouse quieted, until Ashton retreated to his office, and most of the workers went to the residential area. I made my way to the basement, a space I had been told was just mechanical systems and old storage. The door was locked, but the latch was loose enough that I could force it with my shoulder. Stairs led down into darkness. I used my phone flashlight to navigate, the beam cutting through stale air that smelled like sweat and fear. At the bottom was a narrow hallway lined with makeshift cells. Chain-link fence sections bolted to the concrete walls and ceiling, creating cages barely large enough for a person to lie down. 3 of them were occupied. A woman sat in the farthest cell, knees pulled to her chest, eyes wide when my light hit her face. I asked if she was okay, a stupid question given the circumstances, and she said something I could not understand. I tried the door. Padlocked. I pulled out my phone to call 911 and realized I had no signal in the basement. The woman pointed toward the stairs, urgent and terrified, and I understood. Ashton was coming. I ran. Took the stairs 2 at a time, pushed through the door, and came face to face with him standing in the hallway. "You should not have gone down there," he said quietly. "That complicates things." He did not move to grab me, did not raise his voice, just stood blocking the path to the exit while his mind worked through options. "I can offer you a management position," he said finally. "Better pay. Your own space. You clearly have initiative, that is valuable. Or you can leave tonight and never come back and we all forget this happened. But if you choose the second option and I hear that you talk to anyone, we will have a problem. I chose the third option. I ran, shoved past him hard enough that he stumbled backward, sprinted toward the bathroom I had seen workers use, locked myself inside and called 911 from the phone I had smuggled in my pocket, the one rule I had broken by keeping my personal cell on me instead of leaving it in the locker Ashton provided. The operator answered and I whispered the address, whispered about the cells and the locked doors and the people being held, then waited while Ashton pounded on the bathroom door demanding I come out and be reasonable. SWAT arrived 20 minutes later. I heard them breach the front door, heard shouting and commands, heard Ashton trying to explain that this was a misunderstanding, that his workers were there voluntarily, that he ran a legitimate business. They found 34 people in that warehouse, some in the residential area, some working the floor. 3 locked in the basement cells, all of them held through a combination of debt bondage, threats, and physical restraint. Ashton and 6 associates were arrested on federal trafficking charges. The investigation revealed a network spanning 5 states, over 200 victims recovered from similar operations disguised as warehouses, farms, cleaning services, construction companies. The trial lasted 3 months. I testified, describing what I had seen, the locked basement, the man dragged away from the door, Ashton's calm justifications. Other victims testified about being promised legitimate work and then having their documents confiscated, being forced to work 18-hour days, being told they owed thousands of dollars for transportation and housing and would be reported to immigration authorities if they tried to leave. Ashton sat at the defense table taking notes like he was attending a business meeting, occasionally shaking his head when testimony contradicted his version of events. He was convicted on 43 counts, sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. His assets were seized to fund victim compensation. But sitting in that courtroom, watching him accept the verdict with the same calm professionalism he used when offering me that management position, I realized he did not see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a businessman who provided opportunities. The fact that those opportunities involved cages and locked doors and human beings treated as inventory was just an unfortunate necessity of an efficient operation. I entered witness protection for 6 months after the trial. Ashton's organization had reached far enough that prosecutors worried about retaliation. I lived in a town I cannot name, worked a job I cannot describe, and waited for the all-clear that never fully came. Eventually, I moved back to the Northwest under a different name, carrying the knowledge that there are people who look at other human beings and see commodities, resources to be managed and exploited until they break or become unprofitable. I carry guilt, too, for the week I worked there, pretending not to see what was obvious. For every time I walked past the residential area and told myself it was not my business, for almost taking that management position instead of running. Almost is not the same as actually, but the distance between them is smaller than I want to believe. The gallery opening in Spokane's Arts District happened on a warm evening in August 2016. The kind of night where people spilled out onto sidewalks with wine glasses and talked too loud about art they did not entirely understand. I was there covering the event for the local paper, an arts and culture assignment that felt refreshingly normal after months of writing about city council meetings and budget shortfalls. The featured artist was a photographer named Layla Brooks, an emerging talent according to the press release, and her black and white portraits lined the gallery walls in stark, haunting compositions that made you stop and stare. The photographs showed Spokane locations I recognized. Riverfront Park at dawn, the old flour mill, abandoned buildings on the east side slowly being reclaimed by blackberry vines and graffiti, empty parking lots, train tracks cutting through industrial zones. Each image was technically perfect, the kind of composition that understood light and shadow at an instinctive level. But there was something else. Something underneath the beauty that made the hair on my arms stand up. In almost every photograph, barely visible in the background or caught at the edge of the frame, were human shapes. Not clear enough to identify, just suggestions of presence, shadows that might be people or might be tricks of light. Layla stood near the back of the gallery, accepting praise from people who gestured at her work with reverence. She was maybe 30, slight and quiet, with dark hair cut short and clothes that looked intentionally unremarkable. When I introduced myself and asked if I could interview her for the paper, she agreed with a small smile and led me to a quieter corner. I asked about her process, about what drew her to urban landscapes, about how she captured such specific light. She explained that she walked the city at odd hours, usually between 4 and 6 in the morning when Spokane was emptiest and the light was transitional. "That is when you see the city breathing," she said. "When you catch moments between what was and what will be." I asked about the figures in the backgrounds. She looked at me carefully before answering. "You see them too," she said, not quite a question. "Most people do not notice, but once you do, you cannot unsee them. They are part of the transition. People caught in that same in-between space." I pressed for clarification, asking if she staged the shots or if the figures were accidental. She did not answer directly, just said, "I photograph what is there. I do not add anything. I do not take anything away." The article I wrote focused on her technical skill and her unique vision of Spokane as a city of thresholds. It ran in the Sunday edition with 2 of her photographs printed large enough that you could study the details. One reader called the office the next day, an older man who said he recognized the background figure in the riverfront park image. It looked like his, niece, he said. His niece who had gone missing in August 2015. I told him it was probably a coincidence that the figure was too indistinct to make a positive identification, but he insisted. He had stared at her missing person poster for a year. He knew the way she stood, slightly off balance with her weight on her left leg because of an old ankle injury. The shadow in Layla's photograph stood exactly the same way. I went back through the other photographs, the ones that had not run in the paper but were available on the gallery website. I pulled up missing persons reports from Spokane County over the past 3 years. The correlation was impossible to ignore once I started looking. A photograph of the Monroe Street Bridge at dawn contained a figure near the railing that matched the build and posture of a man who had disappeared in November 2014. An image of an empty lot on East Sprague showed someone standing near a chain-link fence, and the clothes visible in silhouette matched what a woman had been wearing when she vanished after leaving work in March 2015. I contacted Layla through the gallery saying I wanted to do a follow-up piece about the public response to her work. We met at a coffee shop downtown. I brought printouts of the photographs and the missing persons reports, laid them on the table between us. Her expression did not change as she looked at them. "People see what they need to see," she said. "Grief makes patterns where none exist. I cannot control how viewers interpret my work." I asked her directly if she had photographed these people, if she knew where they were. She finished her coffee slowly before answering. "I photograph moments before transition," she said again. "I am drawn to places where that energy is strongest. If people are standing in those places, they appear in my work. That is not a crime." Her calm bothered me more than anger would have. I told her I was going to take the information to the police. She nodded like she had expected that, gathered her things, and left. I sat there for another 20 minutes trying to convince myself I was reading too much into coincidence, that my brain was creating connections that were not really there. But I could not unsee the patterns, could not ignore the way every photograph seemed to document someone on the verge of disappearing. The detective I spoke with was skeptical at first. Art critic turned amateur detective was not a scenario that inspired confidence. But I showed him the side-by-side comparisons, walked him through the dates and locations, and watched his expression shift from polite dismissal to genuine concern. He said he would look into it. 3 days later, a search warrant was executed on Layla's studio and residence. What they found was worse than anyone anticipated. Her darkroom contained hundreds of developed photographs that had never been displayed publicly. These were not artistic compositions, they were documentation. Images of people restrained. Images of people in obvious distress. Images of the progression from alive to dying to dead. She had organized them chronologically, labeled with dates and locations, stored in archival boxes like a photographer preserving their life's work. The timeline matched 9 missing persons cases spanning 3 years. 9 people who had disappeared from Spokane without explanation, their bodies never recovered, their cases gone cold. The investigation team found her dump sites using the photographs as guides. She had documented everything with the same attention to composition and light she brought to her gallery work. Each victim had been photographed extensively before death, during, and after. She had posed them in specific locations around the city, places she considered aesthetically significant, and captured what she described in handwritten notes as the moment between life and whatever comes next. The photographs were technical masterpieces. They were also evidence of 9 murders committed with methodical planning and artistic intent. Layla did not run. When police arrived at her studio, she was developing prints, the chemical smell sharp in the enclosed space. She cooperated fully, answering questions with the same detached calm she had shown at the coffee shop. She explained her process like she was teaching a workshop. How she identified subjects through online platforms and dating apps. How she built trust over weeks or months. How she chose locations based on light quality and symbolic significance. How she documented every stage because the work demanded completeness. "You cannot capture transformation if you only photograph one moment," she said during interrogation. "You have to show the entire arc. That is what makes it art." The trial became a media spectacle. Court TV covered it. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Psychologists debated whether she was a psychopath or something stranger. Someone who genuinely could not distinguish between artistic vision and human suffering. Layla sat through testimony about her victims, their families crying in the gallery, and showed no emotion. When asked if she felt remorse, she said, "I feel frustrated that people cannot see past the deaths to understand what I was creating. The deaths were necessary for the work. That was always clear to me." She was convicted on 9 counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without possibility of parole. The photographs entered as evidence were stored in the Spokane Police Department archives, occasionally shown in criminal justice courses as examples of how killers document their crimes. The gallery that had shown her work issued an apology, donated all proceeds from sales to victim support organizations, and destroyed the remaining prints. But digital copies survived. They circulate in true crime forums where people debate the ethics of viewing art created through murder. Some argue the photographs have aesthetic value, independent of their origin. Others say looking at them makes you complicit. I do not know which side is right. I left arts journalism after the trial, could not look at photographs the same way, could not stand in galleries without wondering what violence might be hidden in the margins, what suffering might be aestheticized into beauty. I moved to sports coverage where the stakes are lower and the worst thing that happens is someone loses a game. But sometimes late at night I pull up those images on my laptop. Not the evidence photos, the gallery pieces, the ones that hung on white walls while people sipped wine and talked about composition. I study the shadows in the background, the figures caught in transition, and I try to see what Layla saw. That moment between what was and what will be. Between presence and absence. Between a person and a photograph. I never can. All I see are people who were alive and then were not, and an artist who believed their deaths were justified by the work she created from them. 9 people reduced to subjects. 9 families left with nothing but those images, forced to decide whether to look at the last photographs of their loved ones or preserve their memory without that final, terrible evidence. Layla is in prison now, and according to reports, she spends her time drawing. Sketching other inmates, capturing their faces in graphite with the same technical skill she brought to photography. The prison allows it because art is considered therapeutic, because nobody there understands that for Layla, art was never about healing. It was about preservation, about capturing what she called the most honest moment in any life, the moment when you stop fighting and accept what is coming. She believed she was giving people immortality. All she actually gave them was an ending framed by her vision, their final moments filtered through her lens, their deaths transformed into something she called beautiful, and the rest of us call murder.